Welcome everyone to today's IES webinar, Behaviour Change for Biodiversity Conservation and Update. Today we are joined by Gail Burgess, Behavioural Change Programme Leader at International Union for Conservation of Nature and Traffic. Gail is passionate about using persuasion to help other people realise their role in achieving a sustainable future, bringing 25 years of experience in behavioural science solutions for conservation and environmental impact. The 2019 IPBES Global Assessment highlighted that human values and behaviours are key drivers of ecosystem threats and essential for transformative solutions. This webinar will provide updates of integrating social and behavioural sciences into biodiversity conservation. As always, there's a chance for asking questions at the end of the presentation, so please submit these in the Q&A option at the bottom of your screen at any point during the presentation. I will then ask these on your behalf later. Thank you for everyone logging in today, and I'll now hand over to Gail.
Great, thanks very much, Derek. Hi, everybody. Nice to speak with you today. Thanks very much for your time during what is the UK lunch hour. Greetings to anybody who is joining from further afield. This is a topic that is very dear to my heart. I've worked in this field for what feels like a very long time now. And I thought it was high time that we provided an update on progress, because there has been quite a lot of activity and exciting developments since the last time I did one of these presentations, which amazingly was in July 2018, which is somehow a long time ago now. So since then, as Derek introduced, human behaviour has been recognised as both a problem and solution for biodiversity conservation, in particular in the Intergovernmental Panel on Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services assessment that was published in 2019. This graphic from the summary for policymakers really kind of captured that human values and behaviours were at the root of all of the indirect drivers of threat, risk of extinction. Very dramatic headlines associated with this report when it was released, and in some ways a very important catalyst for increasing recognition that conservation is as much about people as it is about planet. So that recognition continued with the development of what eventually became known as the Biodiversity Plan for Life on Earth, erstwhile recognised as the Kunming-Montreal Global Biodiversity Framework. Perhaps some of you are very familiar with this. The targets that are delineated by the plan really have that in order to achieve effective implementation and achievement of all of the targets, behaviour change, promotion of sustainable lifestyles, and the value of biodiversity is fundamental. And this has also been reinforced through a new initiative undertaken by the United Nations at the Secretary General level, to really bring behavioural science into all of the UN programmes in order to, in particular, advance the achievement of the Sustainable Development Goals. There is a site now dedicated to this work. It's called UN Behavioural Science. I'd really recommend it to anybody that's interested in how behavioural science can be brought to bear across a range of ecological and environmental science issues. All of the members of the UN family are now required to stipulate what they're doing in this field, and that's really helpful because it's increasing the evidence base about what works and what doesn't in many different cultures, countries, and contexts around the world. So if you haven't heard of this before, just do a quick search and it will come up. More relevant to the work that I've been involved in, behavioural science was identified as one of the cross-cutting themes necessary for the 8th replenishment cycle with the GEF programming, so the Global Environment Facility. A range of materials were published as part of this work, in particular this document that features here, not produced by me, but by some people that we work closely with, mainly at RARE. If you haven't heard of RARE, do have a look at their website and their resources. They have a Centre for Behaviour in the Environment, which brings together a lot of the work that they've been doing over the years. Hopefully we'll be able to share the slides with you, the links to all of the material that's referenced across the presentation today is available, so you'll be able to download and have a look at anything you might be interested to dig into further. But this scientific and technical advisory panel document included important kind of pointers for how to take behaviour change forward through the GEF 8 programming. And one of the integrated programs, as they call them, that we've been heavily involved in, I work at Traffic, which works to ensure that wildlife trade is not a threat to the conservation of nature. Our initiative and our support is being put towards something called the Global Wildlife Programme. So this particular initiative is a coordination body for 38 countries across Africa, Asia, and Latin America. They're involved in implementing projects looking at a variety of issues to do with wildlife conservation for development. It's hosted by the World Bank, supported by the GEF Secretariat, and it's led with a collaboration of some of the implementing programs for the GEF portfolio bank and a range of IGOs and NGOs that you can see on the left-hand side there. This body's been going for some time. With respect to the 8th replenishment cycle, this is their theory of change. You are not expected to read the small print. I really wanted to be able to share with you the 4 major component work areas that are sitting underneath the overall Global Wildlife Programme, looking at topics such as coexistence of people and wildlife. So if you go down to the bottom third of the page, you'll see the headings across left to right there. So human-wildlife conflict and coexistence, as it might be in others' language and reference points. The topic that I have most experience on, looking at illegal, unsustainable and high zoonotic risk wildlife use and trade. Also thinking about wildlife for prosperity, so looking at nature-based economies, which could include nature-based tourism, and thinking about the coordination and knowledge exchange across all of those fields. Sometimes a lot of the work at landscape level is interconnected, and I'm sure many of you will have your own direct experience of that. So it's a really exciting programme, the Global Wildlife Programme. We've been very happy to be involved in leading a technical support programme focused on the role of behavioural change for biodiversity conservation, supporting all of those 38 countries to deliver against those component work areas. The tools and resources that we're involved in developing include toolkits, roadmaps, guidance notes, and what's called knowledge events. I put the link to the website where you'll find a lot more information about these things. It's a very rich and vibrant field. We're obviously trying to translate some of the science into practical resources for government officials often that are natural mandate to become social scientists, but at the same time they recognise the importance of bringing behaviour change into their work. So our role is really to help them identify how to do that. And it's been great to see increasing appetite for this as the years have progressed. It's a really vibrant time to be involved in this work at this point. So just to give you a little bit of detail, I don't know how many of you are familiar with the work on human-wildlife conflict and coexistence. This is a particular priority for many countries around the world, what could be termed a wicked problem, often at landscape level, with increasing pressures on local resources from both people and the wildlife populations they live alongside. And what we've tried to do is identify the behavioural change entry points, as it's called, for some of these projects to incorporate in their programme designs. They're at the point now where they're developing their concepts and their overall approaches for the next 4 to 5 years. And they will be submitting those into the GEF Council meeting that's due to be held in February next year. So really the time is now to figure this out. And this has been a really interesting exercise to try and come up with some language and some examples that could be relevant to a variety of different landscapes, geographies, and human geography kind of dimensions. So the architecture that we've kind of come up with, the domain area we called each of the component work areas domains, and we identified the relevance to the Montreal Global Biodiversity Framework targets, because this is language that many governments and many of the target audiences for this work already have connections with and familiarity with. So the GSAP abbreviation here relates to the IUCN Global Species Action Plan, which is intended to provide an implementation framework that sits underneath the biodiversity plan. And I'm not going to read out the reference points, but we wanted to orient our advice and the explanations about behaviour change entry points within that frame of reference, because that helped to legitimise it and position it in a way that's meaningful to some of the governments that we're in discussion with. So we identified relevant to both the domain, the biodiversity plan targets, and the GSAP reference points, possible approaches. We have 3 here relevant to human-wildlife conflict and coexistence. These are the ones that we've come up with. I'm sure you probably have examples of others that you may be working on yourself. We identified reduce the incidences of human-wildlife conflict and the losses associated with that by communities, reduce retaliatory killing of wildlife associated with those losses, and try overall to help communities improve attitudes towards wildlife and conservation. Very ambitious activities, but often something that many of the governments or the country directors are thinking about trying to navigate anyway. So sitting underneath those possible approaches, thinking about some of the activities that could be undertaken, for example, trying to change the behaviour of individuals so that they don't directly engage with wild animals. And often when people think of this topic area, they tend to think of pachyderms, pangolins, big cats, predation incidences or destruction of crops or property. But some of the major human-wildlife conflict issues are to do with smaller animals, so snake and invertebrate bites, farmers out in the fields and at risk of very dangerous incidences often with these animals. So some of the behaviours that could be adopted could be wearing protective clothing, adopting certain postures or making certain noises, working together in groups and covering areas at the right times of day to reduce your risk of a conflict incidents occurring. When you do encounter wildlife, not threatening wildlife. So the way that these are written, we've tried to make sure that they're described as behaviours. But I'll come on in a moment some of the challenges that we had when we were coming up with definitions that would be understandable, often to teams and people whose first language, of course, would not be English, but also in a way that aligns with some of the scientific text around how you define a behaviour, rather than write something down that could be read as an activity. So lots of discussion with some of the expert group that we engaged in this work around those topic areas. In terms of preempting or minimising wildlife conflict before it happens, using early warning systems, there's some great material available from IUCN has wildlife conflict and coexistence specialist group that's got some great toolkits freely available online around these topic areas, and thinking about the use of dogs to protect livestock where that's relevant. Everything is context specific and should be pre-tested or considered with the community before it's introduced, but also thinking about encouraging neighbouring villages or neighbouring areas to work together to identify potentially problematic animals before they arrive and taking action accordingly. In terms of the what, who and how for reducing retaliatory killing of wildlife, thinking about working with those at highest risk. So this may not necessarily be threats to human beings, it may be threats to livestock and other forms of property, not going out and engaging in retaliatory killings where problems occur, working with communities to report to the relevant authorities. And this is a really complicated area. There are often lots of reasons why relevant authorities may not wish to report incidences when they occur. So trying to understand the human factors behind that, thinking about things like if individuals are harvesting materials in an area where they're not supposed to be, and they encounter, say, a tiger on the edge of a protected area. When that happens, they may not be willing to report it just because they themselves fear getting into trouble. So lots of important social dynamics to understand as part of that. The graphic on the right, I feel I should explain. This tiger bus, as it was called, was developed in an initiative of social marketing at risk of tiger predation, and engaged people who had been attacked by tigers in the past as kind of advocates. They were willing to be advocates for tiger protection, and to talk to people about when to harvest, where to do it, and how to, in general, reduce the risk of conflict incidences and encounters with tigers overall. So improving community attitudes, obviously a very nuanced and deep understanding is required to help community members feel that wildlife is beneficial. We've done some work looking at in Bhutan, beautiful mountains, we've seen gorgeous pictures of that, and the communities that live there really need to be able to see the benefit from nature-based tourism initiatives, and often that's quite complicated. It involves lots of systems and frameworks that need to be adapted to ensure that community members see the benefit of wildlife rather than the cost of loss of land or inability to expand agriculture or small holdings into areas that might be protected. So lots to think of at the local level, but for the point of defining behavioural entry points, this has been our starting point. We actually came up with 25 behaviours in each of the three main domains of human-wildlife conflict, illegal wildlife trade, and nature-based tourism. By collaborating with an expert group, they represented some of the target audience, the beneficiaries of our support and advice under the technical support programme. So representatives often of the countries that we were trying to work with, but also some top-level behavioural scientists from different academic institutions around the world, and those who were specialists in each of the conservation issues that we were dealing with. So a relatively small group, 12 people, I think, in total, participated in an exercise to try to identify. So we identified by looking at the literature around necessity, feasibility, and utility, the headings that we came up with in the end. The scores were more heavily weighted, so the necessity value for each of the behaviours really was intended to reflect the impact that could be achieved according to the prevalence and frequency of the negative behaviour and what change could achieve as an overall kind of measure of progress against the conservation issue that was being encountered. Feasibility tried to generate a score relevant for the plasticity of the behaviour. Some behaviours are a lot more habitual than others. And in truth, there's very little evidence about that so far, but the exercise was intended to kind of reveal these shortcomings so that we could identify what needed to be done in order to crystallise the priority behaviours more robustly. Thinking about the cost overall as well of interventions, this varies significantly, of course, according to the country of delivery, but as a general measure, this wasn't intended to be very quantitative. It was much more subjective according to each of the experts' impression and their experience of trying to deliver any behaviour change initiatives relevant to the list of behaviours that we were presenting. Utility really looked at how scalable the behaviour change might be, and again, this was something important to look at, but not really very easy to robustly defend in terms of your decision about a score. So we came up with these values. They were very much intended to be a test. So this is not definitive. Please don't take away that these are most important behaviours to change. That wasn't our ambition. It was just to really explore, rather than present people with just a very broad suite of behaviours that they might consider changing. You know, if you had limited resources in terms of time, skill, or money, where should you focus your attention, and how could we help some of the countries that might use this information come to those decisions on their own? What would it involve, and how could we give them robust advice to do that? So we looked at developing some of the top scoring behaviours. These were the ones that for each of the 3 fields, the top 4 behaviours that scored. However, the exercise really reinforced that often the experts gave, you know, they weighted things very differently. I think any educator would know that this is a risk. You base it on your own opinion, and some scorers are more generous than others. Some of the scorers felt that they had much stronger expertise in one particular domain and not the others. And so there were inconsistencies, natural variances across the expert group, and we expected that. We did our best to kind of try to adjust for it, but inevitably it did lead to some sort of weighting amongst the different categories that were represented here. So one thing that really surprised me, one of the behaviours was try to remove indiscriminate hunting methods. So thinking about snares, mist nets, and deadfall traps. These are a real scourge for biodiversity, have very direct and measurable impacts for many species around the world. In protected areas, this is a real threat because it will trap, of course, anything, and many of the mechanisms used are quite durable in the landscape. So unless you remove them, or hunters remember where they are, they're out there then for good. But this didn't score quite as highly as expected. This is number 9 in the list, so you can see it's in the bottom third of the values represented there. And this really reinforced to us the variability of this scoring process. So an interesting exercise to explore that. Based on some of the discussion with the target audience, we recognise that the most influential determinants of what behaviours might be undertaken, looking at things like necessity, so what impact could they achieve really, and the feasibility of interventions. There was quite an interesting spread of the behaviours within those 2 categories, rather than looking at all 3 with utility as well. And then when we did look at utility as well, we tried to identify if any of the behaviours in the list scored highly across all 3 of the domains, and quite useful to understand that sometimes the most necessary behaviour is feasible to change. So a good example here would be, say, number 1, which features quite highly in the feasibility score, but quite low in terms of the utilities in the second half of the scores. Nothing came in the top 20% of all of the rankings that we used. So again, not to say that these are the behaviours that would be undertaken, but very useful exercise to show what we're trying to do in order to demonstrate greater kind of delineation really between when you say do behaviour change, what that means on the ground, and how those that are in a good position to bring behaviour change into their projects and programmes can make more informed choices about the behaviours that they wish to move forward with. Just take a little bit of time now to explain how that fits into some of the wider work that I've been involved in. So as I mentioned, I work at Traffic, and our work is trying to ensure that wildlife trade is not a threat to the conservation of nature, and that trade in wild species is legal and sustainable. We have 2 main goals that we work on, trying to reduce illegal trade and trying to encourage social, economic and environmental benefits to people from legal and sustainable trade. Wildlife trade is not just about mammals. I think a lot of people in their minds kind of immediately go to pictures of wild mammals used often for meat or for things like ivory or rhino horn, very high profile in the media. In the Convention on International Trade in Endangered Species, about 30,000 of the 40-odd thousand species listed under that convention are actually flora, not fauna. That's often kind of not realised or overlooked in some of the dialogue process. So we work across all of the taxa that could be threatened by trade, and we take often a trade chain approach. So thinking about trade route stages at source, so these are in many countries around the world. We've looked at the role of social science and social surveys in particular, with those convicted of wildlife trade offences at source, so poaching in particular. This set of interviews that was conducted in South Africa was really insightful, because there are many reasons why people poach. I think it's really important to tell the human stories behind some of the statistics about poaching. And often the people in prisons are, the people who perhaps couldn't pay a bribe, or were in the wrong place at the wrong time. They just made a bad decision on one day. The human cost of their that decision, or the fact that they're in jail, sources available on the link provided to show the importance of social research around the world. It's once people are convicted, it's really helpful to understand the drivers for their engagement in these activities in order to engage communities in tackling this in the future. And behaviour change has a strong role to play as a result of that. So really interesting piece of work. I do commend it to people interested in landscape level issues such as this. We've also been doing work with wildlife farmers. This is a lady in Vietnam. We've been looking at the risk of zoonotic disease transfers, looking at behaviour change with wildlife farmers to make sure that they use PPE. Often that's not the case. We've sort of seen the need for behaviour change in terms of simple behaviours such as hand washing, use of personal protective equipment, and regular sanitisation of equipment used to house animals, looking at issues such as animal husbandry, etc. Actually, some great material available on the UK website if you're interested in this and haven't seen it. Really helpful set of materials that were kind of adapted for some of the behaviour change interventions that we've delivered. And we're currently evaluating the results of this work. So if you're interested to know more, please drop me a line. Happy to share more. Also looking in East Africa at wild meat value chains. So there's something called a game meat regulation in Tanzania, which has been brought in. Wild meat overharvesting is absolutely decimating many populations of animals in many parts of Central and East Africa. It's a major threat to biodiversity often in those countries. But what they've done in Tanzania is quite bold, quite brave. They've brought in a new regulation, which means that game meat can be harvested legally by community. And this has come in 2018, but work to try and ensure that the wild meat value chain is operating effectively, that wild meat is sourced sustainably and from the right species is still occurring. So again, we've been delivering social and behaviour change initiatives with communities in this area, some of the villagers in the area, to try to reduce the incidences of illegal wildlife hunting and overharvesting, and to explore what would generate more appetite for interest in the wild meat that's proven to be sustainably harvested. So a couple of links there if you're interested to understand a bit more about this in East Africa. So obviously where wildlife is going and how far it has to travel in order to get there really varies according to which commodity chain you're looking at. But for the role of behaviour change, we feel has very important potential to help improve insight into things like corruption. This is really widespread as a driver of some types of illegal wildlife trade around the world. So was involved in a problem analysis and state of the field review. Social norm and behaviour change interventions have a very proven role with other forms of corruption, but they've yet to be tested with illegal wildlife trade specifically in mind. So We engaged with the Basel Institute in Governance on this big problem analysis, and next steps, we hope to deliver some pilots in this space. So hope to speak to you again in the future about that. Thinking about behaviourally informed approaches to investigation of wildlife crimes when they occur. It is possible to do things like offender profiling and look at behaviour analysis. So simple techniques that you can give those on the front lines, looking at inspecting kind of shipments or cargo, talking to people involved in transit situations, thinking about some of the behavioural analysis that's a standard part of policing at these checkpoints, but bringing it in specifically in relation to wildlife related scrutiny. This is a unique area, and it's been good to see increasing uptake happening in recent years. And also thinking about the influence that you can achieve. So, for example, improving motivation and productivity of law enforcement officials, and understanding barriers, some of the human factors that might influence, poor performance at checkpoints or roadblocks, to help stop wildlife offences before they leave the country and go elsewhere. We've done quite a lot of work in different markets around the world, often in Asia. The next 3 slides focus on the work that we've been doing in Asia. So the origin of a lot of work that I was involved in was looking at how behaviour change could be brought in as a consumer engagement strategy to mitigate the consumption of illegal wildlife products. A range here feature on the page. We have done a lot of work on the consumption of ivory in China. Recent analyses have shown that this is much less popular now than it used to be. So really promising to see the whole confluence of activity that came together, in particular the domestic ivory ban in China, excuse me, which really contributed towards the achievement of this target. Also looking at rosewood consumption. So rosewood is a commercial classification relating to many species of Dalbergia, a hardwood that's available in a lot of tropical countries around the world. Maybe some of you would know about this. It's a very difficult issue. There is legal rosewood trade in China, and there's something called a Hongmu standard, which is a quality assurance standard for this commodity, but it doesn't look at excuse me, sorry, proven sustainability of the supply. And this is something that therefore we were able to try to explore some of the policy opportunities for change. Excuse me while I just take lots of talking, apologies. So this was the work in China. We also did some work in Thailand, looking at the consumption of illegal wild meat in Thailand, and we delivered a behaviour change intervention with the younger audiences in urban environments in Thailand who, for the point of curiosity or novelty, were sort of exploring wild meat dishes. Sometimes, although there are meats that are very clearly illegal, so pangolin meat would be a really good example of that. Some of the wild meat that's on menus can be legal as well as illegal. So it really depends where it's harvested from. A particular example would be wild boar, which, in Europe is also something you can consume. In Thailand, whether wild boar is legal or illegal depends on its origin. So if it's been harvested from a protected area, it's illegal. So we wanted to cause interest in appreciating some of the challenges and to change their behaviour accordingly. We had a really good reaction to something called the Kind Dining Initiative, which we used as our vehicle to deliver engagement on this. Importantly, a strategy we try to adopt is not just to push our values on people, so to promote conservation for its own sake. Although often in surveys people will respond that they care about the planet and protection of wildlife, when it comes to their everyday decision making, that's not always the case. And so it's important to speak to the things that do matter to them and shows them the desirable behaviour to change. So we did that in Thailand. The key spokespeople that we engaged include an actor, the Department of National Parks vet, and a celebrity chef. And we worked with the celebrity chef on dining deliveries. So looking at using sustainable alternatives that could deliver tasty dishes and help meet people's need for curiosity, which was one of the major drivers of this trade. Really good results from the survey that we conducted in follow-up, with 74% reported being demotivated to engage in illegal wild meat consumption in the future. We've done a lot of work in Vietnam, finally, looking at the consumption of rhino horn. This actually is often for status, and very particular target audience here called Mr. L. We developed a consumer archetype, which is very common with consumer marketing companies, if you've ever worked with them. And they worked very hard to avoid using images of rhinos, to instead focus on encouraging Mr. L to rely on his own inner strength, his own sense of character, to prove he was successful, to demonstrate his status, and not to rely on kind of an external substance to sort of show his inner strength by rejecting the use of rhino horn. And over the I think in total 6 years that we delivered this initiative, from 2014 to 2020, we achieved promising results, with still more to do, but definitely good progress with the rejection of rhino horn amongst this particular target audience in urban environments. This compendium of kind of experience has helped us to develop information for all of the parties. There are 189 parties registered under the Convention in International Trade in Endangered Species, and we've provided guidance to help them use behaviour change to reduce demand for illegally traded wildlife. And this is now formalised. There is a resolution requiring all of the parties where there is illegal trade and illegal consumption in their responsibility area. They now have to use demand reduction strategies, and our guidance kind of helps them do that using a behaviour change approach. We're now rolling out regional training events, due to go to Lusaka in Zambia in 2 weeks to do the Africa regional training. The photo here was from the Asia regional training last year. Very good participation. Again, these government officials, they're not specialists in behavioural science, but they appreciate the need for it, and they're interested to understand what they can do in practical terms. So some really interesting discussions, quite rich discussions to try to figure that out. Some lessons learned in summary. So we've developed these behaviour change benchmarks. You may have your own. I know for environmental science, I've worked on others. So these aren't the only ones out there, but they're the ones that we've identified. We have 10 benchmarks in a checklist, and we've tried to show that to design an initiative that would bring any of these principles in would be useful. But there is a progression, so you don't have to deliver all 10 immediately, but if you can work towards achievement of all 10 eventually, that's kind of the pathway to ensuring behaviour change is incorporated in your work. And we've condensed each of these benchmarks into 5 really important overarching factors. So thinking about the enabling environment for change, a good example is making sure that the social norm is conducive towards the behaviour to change, and not the opposite. Often in some of the work that we're doing with consumer audiences, for example, it's seen to be mainstream to consume certain products, and we need to shift that narrative so that consumer audiences do see the benefit of making the behaviour to change, making sure that initiatives are informed by rich insights and are appropriately targeted, so not delivered just as general public awareness communications at the national level, but thinking about defining a target audience. So similar to Mr. L, this was a middle-aged male in urban environments. We knew he was a business leader who was very focused on growing his business, making sure that you have insight sufficient in order to segment appropriately. Perhaps some of you have done that in your own settings. With the theories and frameworks, being sure that you understand the options available for the behaviours to change. There are many theories and frameworks out there, and some of them are defined specifically in relation to environmental behaviours. DEFRA in 2008 developed a really good framework for pro-environment behaviours. Hopefully many of you have seen that already. But just being sure that you're basing it on insight in this area as well, because it's important not to use suppositions, but when you design an initiative, making sure that you are referencing this good body of literature from another side. Where you design communications-based approaches, thinking about the messengers and messaging that you use. As I say, we've tried to avoid overt conservation branding because we feel that other approaches have more merit, and repeating and adapting and rewarding communications that achieve progress, making sure that the target audience feels recognised for the progress that they've made, and that you can adapt where you need to. All behaviour change approaches may need fine-tuning as they progress, and it's important to make changes over time. Commercial marketers already know this, so that's why you see kind of consistently branded advertising campaigns that have slight change over time. So these 5 areas are something that we feel really work, and the evidence, our experience and the evidence really reinforce the importance of considering this if you're interested to take behaviour change forward in your own work. So if you're interested to know more, we have developed a behaviour change toolkit. That's the one on the bottom right on the screen here. The links are available there. The rare materials, they have a centre for behaviour in the environment, as I mentioned, that's in the top right. The link is already there. There's some great courses and things that you can take on that site as well. There is also now, very recently, an IUCN Behaviour Change Task Force. They've been engaging a number of representatives across the sector, conservation sector, trying to bring together an understanding of what the need is for more behaviour change evidence and insight across the field. So we're waiting for that needs assessment now to be published. But the link is there if you're interested to follow their work and to hear more about this. Because that's a good source of something that might be relevant for your interest areas. Thank you. Encouraging you to have a look as well at the materials on the UN website. So UN Behavioural Science is the latest initiative, and moving forwards, they have produced a policy framework which will underpin evolution of the UN through to the 21st century, as they describe it. So there's quite a lot of material coming through under that auspice as well. Very much looking forward to seeing where they take this work. Thanks very much. Back to you, Derek.
Thank you for that, Gail. And we can post any of the links on our website when we post the recording of the webinar on there. I just wanted to ask a quick question before we get into the Q&A, and just if anyone does have a question, just please pop it in the Q&A function. You mentioned on the that you like it to be led from within the communities, and I just wanted to ask, do you have challenges around that, or are people quite happy to get involved? Has it been quite successful?
Yes, I mean the way that we do it in many of the Asian contexts in which we work has been to identify partner organisations who. So one key partner for us has been the Vietnam Chamber of Commerce and Industry, for example, and they represent business leaders in very different kind of contexts around Vietnam. They have different subsets according to, so there's a CEO network, and then there's women-specific subset. Often it's about, because it's a Chamber of Commerce, it's relevant to small and medium-sized enterprises. But we've worked hand in hand with them to design communications, to do pre-tests of communications, to distribute the messaging. So one of the examples are avoiding illegal wildlife trade is good for brand visibility, business integrity, making sure that businesses see this as a core part of good business practice. And they have really helped us to design the messaging and to roll that out through their master trainers network. So that's kind of the way that we do it. Thinking about much more local communities, I mean, we always go with, so for example, in the context of the wild meat work in Tanzania, there are community-based organisations working with the 15 villages in the Kwakachinja corridor, where we will involve people in participatory engagement processes, co-design initiatives, to really kind of pin down, you know, what's going to help you, what would you be open to, what do you think is not suitable for this current context and this situation. And that's been really important because you know, there's a lot of criticism, especially with behaviour change, that Western NGOs bring their mindset and their values in, and they try to promote inappropriate change amongst these target audiences. We've specifically sought to avoid that. And Traffic has a network of offices around the world, so you know they're all nationals of those countries in those teams often. So we feel that's a really important starting point for design of this work.
Fantastic, thank you. So our first question then is from Kavari, and it says, great presentations. Any updates on poaching routes around the sub-Saharan African region?
Yeah, it depends on the taxa that you're really interested in. I think we've done quite a lot of work with wild meat overharvesting, for example, and I think there's a lot of species that are threatened by this, as I mentioned in my slides, from Central and Eastern Africa in particular. There are surveys available for the volume of animals that are taken, not by Traffic, but by other groups. So some examples include CIFOR. I don't know if you've ever heard of them, CIFOR. It's the Forestry Research Institute. And the trouble with some of the wild meat surveys is that it's very difficult. There aren't always systematic assessments. So there's an initiative in Central Africa to undertake routine monitoring of wild meat overharvesting, just to understand which species are impacted, rather than just volumetric assessments of the amount of meat in the market. It depends on whether you can actually tell what the species is versus what it's being marketed at the retail level, because that's often where NGOs, for example, are looking. But this particular system in Central Africa called CIVBAC, that's something that's been brought in to try and address that. If you're thinking about pachyderm poaching rates in particular, there is a system called the MIKE system. It's monitoring the illegal killing of elephants, and that's run by the CITES Secretariat. So you can go on the CITES website and have a look at the latest reports for that. IUCN do also, for each of the conference of parties under CITES, produce systematic assessment looking at the illegal killing of rhinos. So rhino poaching is very heavily monitored in South Africa, where the majority of rhino populations are. But if you wanted that more national context and also to look at the Asian statistics, then I would go to the IUCN reports, which are prepared for each of the COPs. So if you look at the CITES COP19, which was the most recent one, there's an IUCN report on rhino poaching incidents available under that heading.
Thank you. Question here from John. Thank you for a very interesting webinar. Is the programme implemented independently or in cooperation with the existing formal and non-formal education programme?
It's a good question. We're not involved in direct delivery of education. So my office is based in Cambridge Conservation Initiative, which has an affiliation with the University of Cambridge. So we do share some of the materials with the MPhil in conservation leadership. So we do have that association. But I'm trying to think if any of the projects that I mentioned have like a formal schooling component. Not that I can think of from memory. yeah, I think the way that a lot of the work in this space is happening at the moment is to share case studies. We're often invited to speak and provide guest tuition to some of the master's level courses. We have association with those that run wildlife trade specific content. So we do provide case studies into those systems, but not in terms of formal education of sort of the practitioners that we work with, some of the natural resource ministry professionals, because their needs are quite different. So yeah, we tend to provide signposting to relevant online resources, but when we deliver training, we do it in a sort of more bespoke manner. I hope that answers that question.
Great. Just one final question. Thanks, Gail. Really fascinating and helpful. Have you looked into behaviour change strategies for perpetrators and intermediaries in illegal activities and within regulation, law enforcement, and criminal justice systems?
Yeah, that's a great question. Thank you. We're looking at expanding this area of our work. So we've done quite a bit on corruption and the role of behavioural science in helping to combat corruption before it occurs, and to invoke informal community controls against it, so that there's quite an established literature around that. For those that know about that, you're probably familiar with it. But in terms of trying to work to reduce offences, yes, we're interested in one of the slides that I presented provided this set of areas where we're looking at the use of behaviourally informed approaches in terms of insight, investigation, and influence. So we have previously spoken to the Institute of Criminology at Cambridge University. I'm at the point now where I'm trying to develop some proofs of concept for each of the areas where we wish to apply behaviourally informed approaches. It's a very new area. There's not a lot of work happening in this space at this time. But I see it as a natural kind of next step for work in this space, because a lot of the more progressive kind of policing institutions and judiciary prosecutors, that they kind of have this in their training and their formal training systems, but we're not really making that link to the training that's already also being offered around wildlife trade offences. And I think I see that as kind of the next step. So happy to have a long conversation about that. It's something I'm really interested to do. Thanks.
Perfect. Thank you so much for that and answering the questions. That is it from us today, attendees. Thank you for logging in. I hope you found it beneficial and informative.